Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Mr. President, I've come to the floor to join my colleague from Alaska, Senator Sullivan, in support of Senate Joint Resolution 80. As Senator Sullivan explained earlier, this resolution will disapprove the integrated activity plan the Biden administration issued back in 2022 to manage the National Petroleum Reserve in Northwest Alaska. He's sponsored it, I've co-sponsored it, because the Biden administration imposed this management plan over not only our objections, but the objection of leaders from across Alaska's North Slope. The third member of our delegation, Congressman Begich, has introduced House Joint Resolution 124, which is identical and is pending in the House of Representatives. I think it's important to outline a little bit of the history on this issue. I don't want to go into all of it, but the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, we call it NPRA, is a 23 million acre tract of land. It's roughly the size of the state of Indiana. It was specifically designated for responsible energy development. The Petroleum Reserve dates back a century to President Harding's withdrawal and initial control by the U.S. Navy. Now, more recently, Congress has come to understand not only the naval value, but the national value of the area. They've directed the Department of Interior to conduct an expeditious program of competitive leasing of oil and gas in the reserve to help boost our energy security. And what I've just shared there is a word-for-word requirement from existing federal law. So this is what is in law, to conduct an expeditious program of competitive leasing of oil and gas in the reserve. The department is mandated to do that while protecting important values, including sensitive areas, as well as providing for subsistence use for Alaskans. This is generally Alaska Natives who live in the North Slope area. Congress really envisioned this as a balance here, where you had responsible exploration and development moving in tandem with strong environmental protection and subsistence rights. And the statute is pretty clear. It kind of spells it out. And we're okay with that. We don't have a problem with that. That's kind of the Alaska way. But unfortunately, the Biden administration ignored that. Instead of providing for balanced management, the last administration ignored what I think was a good plan that was already in place. They ignored federal law. They ignored the congressional delegation. They ignored the people who live on the North Slope. And I think that they also ignored or overlooked our history of responsible production, our energy security, and they instead prioritized conservation over everything else. And so that's why we're here. The 2022 Integrated Activity Plan cut off access, to cut off leasing, to cut off development in our petroleum reserve. And that was not an accident. That was the goal here. That was the intent. The 2022 plan they admit that it will reduce oil and gas activity, which was fine in the eyes of the Biden administration because right as they were putting sanctions on Alaska, they were taking them off of places like Iran and Venezuela to free up those nations to produce more. So let me reiterate how the Biden administration went about doing this. The 2022 plan replaced the 2020 plan, which is put in place after an environmental review process that featured public comment and significant consultation with communities and leaders on the North Slope. And under that 2020 plan, the BLM concluded that 18.6 million acres, this was 82% of the NPRA, should be open for potential leasing. But in the 2022 plan, just 11.8 million acres, 52% of the petroleum reserve were left open for that purpose. Under the 2020 plan, 4.3 million acres were closed to new infrastructure with no development across millions of additional acres subject to requirements for no surface occupancy, seasonal timing, other sensible protections. But then the 2022 plan rejected that, closing off 8.3 million acres to any new infrastructure. The 2020 plan was well received by most Alaskans because it was viewed as balanced. BLM crafted a plan that was, as the agency wrote at the time, quote, suitably specific for broad-scale management decisions. Additional site-specific analysis will occur when BLM receives an application to approve an action on the ground. This will be done through subsequent NEPA reviews and analysis, which will be conducted before BLM issues permits or approvals for any ground-disturbing activity. So in other words, what you had was a high-level management framework. No individual projects were approved. Any seeking to advance were still going to have to go through a separate permitting process before being allowed to do so. But unfortunately, BLM abandoned that approach after the Biden administration took office, and they didn't base their 2022 plan on any new scientific analysis or new environmental review process. They based it on a political agenda and their preference to what they called keep it in the ground. And they issued a determination of NEPA adequacy and then went into the 2020 plan and selected a far more restrictive alternative from it. So with virtually no public process, no public comment, no consultation with Alaska Natives who call the North Slope home, the Biden administration unilaterally cut off access to 6.8 million acres of our petroleum reserve. That's an area that's larger than the individual states of Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Hawaii. It's clearly not what the delegation wanted. It's not what most Alaskans wanted. And as I explained when discussing the administrative withdrawals in the Central Yukon Plan just a few weeks back, it violates multiple Alaska-specific statutes. And I should add that this was just one plank in the Biden administration's plan to shut down development in our petroleum reserve. So in addition to cutting off access, they refused to hold a single lease sale in the NPRA during their time in office. They dragged the Willow Project through years of additional process, sending a signal that nobody else should dare try to develop there. They issued a management rule that turned the law on its head by establishing a presumption against new development. And they initiated another process to expand and designate new special areas where no development would be allowed to occur. And then just a few days before leaving office, an acting deputy secretary issued a memo with interim management measures to further tilt the balance away from any potential development. So what you had was an administration that wanted nothing to do with responsible development in Alaska's petroleum reserve. And that was enough to cause some whiplash for those of us who not only know the law, but also remember the Obama-Biden administration repeatedly urging companies, go over there, go to the National Petroleum Reserve. This was the big fight over ANWR, and they said, don't go to ANWR, go to NPRA. So I've kind of outlined the history of this, some of the politics of it, but I would suggest that folks just shouldn't take the delegation's word for it either. We received a letter from the North Slope Trilateral. This is the political leadership on the North Slope, consisting of the North Slope Borough, the Inupiat community of the Arctic Slope, and the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. And they weighed in with their strong support for this disapproval resolution. And in their words, and I'm quoting here, the NPRA lies entirely within the homelands of the North Slope Inupiat. Congress established the NPRA with a clear purpose: to ensure energy security for the nation while respecting the needs of Alaska Natives. Despite that, the 2022 plan imposed sweeping restrictions that curtail responsible development, undermine congressional intent, and disregard the well-being of the people who depend on these lands for both subsistence and livelihoods. And the letter then goes on to explain how the impacts of the 2022 plan are especially severe for the North Slope, Oil and gas development in the NPRA funds the borough's schools, emergency services, and infrastructure. It supports jobs for Inupiaq shareholders and residents. It underwrites the continuation of our communities even as we maintain our subsistence way of life. By arbitrarily locking away vast portions of the NPRA, BLM's rule threatens these essential services and imposes disproportionate burdens on our people. It's equally concerning, BLM failed to engage in meaningful government-to-government consultation with ASRC, the borough, and ICAS. This omission contradicts federal consultation requirements and disregards the voices of the very communities most affected. Our leadership has consistently raised concerns about this process and its outcomes, yet those concerns were ignored. So I think the words from the North Slope Trilateral are particularly strong and powerful, and I thank them for their leadership on the issues. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the full text of their letter be added to the congressional record immediately following my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there's a good chance you will see Senator Sullivan and me here on the floor of the Senate seeking to disapprove any administrative action that unreasonably restricts access to public land in our home state. That's exactly what happened in this 2022 plan. Like we saw so much in the Biden administration, it lacked balance and it failed to adhere to the law. We feel pretty strongly back home that we don't need Washington, D.C. to try to protect Alaska from Alaskans. We need Washington, D.C. to understand that no one cares more about Alaska, our lands, the people, than those who live there. And that what we're seeking is to partner with those on balanced management of our lands. And that's true across our state, and that's true within the NPRA. We had a good framework for responsible development in our petroleum reserve back in 2020. Today, we can vote to nullify the 2022 replacement and go back to it. So I would urge my colleagues, when we have this measure before us tomorrow for final, I would urge support for the resolution. Mr. President, I yield the floor.